Hello, I'm Octavius Obe. Welcome. Today we are taking a dive into the history of Arthington. Joining me, of course, is Dr. C. Patrick Burrowes, and Dr. Burrowes has written numerous books on Liberia, but today we are looking at Arthington. Doc, first of all, how are you feeling today?
Wonderful, wonderful. Very excited to be able to share this story of Arthington's history. It's very important for us to share with Arthingtonians as they gather some aspects of their story that many of them may not even be aware of.
So let's jump right in. The context of the importance of the history of Arthington, not just for Arthingtonians, but for Liberia as a whole.
Arthington's story is on the level of any heroic set of circumstances that would characterize, stories the history of other places, but it has not received that recognition. The truth of the matter is that this relatively small community, which was started by people with limited resources, had an impact, and I mean a significant impact, on the history of Liberia. But beyond that, it had an impact on the world.
And of course, we'll get into the significance of the story, the impact on the world, and all of that. But the natural place to start is with Mr. Robert Arthington,
Yes.
the English businessman who put up the seed money, if you may, for the town of Arthington. Who was this guy? And let me put a question in Liberian terms now. What was his interest in having a city or town in Liberia?
Yeah. Now, Arthington inherited a business from his father. It was a brewery, and it was very successful. And the fact that his father went into brewing was somewhat of an anomaly because the family were Quakers, and Quakers had very strong views against using arms, going to war. Many of them were also opposed to the consumption of alcohol, but they were also strongly opposed to slavery. So the early trends against slavery or in favor of abolition in the West trace back to the Quakers in England and in the U.S., Quakers in the U.S. as well. So that was its beginning. He inherits his father's business. But what is different about Robert is that he becomes a Baptist, and the Baptists too had a strong opposition to slavery, and he pursues that, and he starts to engage in philanthropy, and the money that he provided for the founding of the town of Arthington, basically for the land to be purchased from the people who had been living in that area. That money that he provided was just part of what he was doing at the time, towards these philanthropic ends. The fact that someone in England took an interest in Liberia in that way was not really unusual. The town of Edina was actually named that because the money for Edina came from people in Edinburgh in Scotland. Yeah. And to tell you the truth, and I won't go into a lot of details here, but to tell you the truth, the model for the founding of Liberia by the ACS was copied from British philanthropists. British philanthropists pressured their government to intercept slave ships and to move in the direction of anti-slavery and eventual abolition of slavery in the British colonies. And the ACS thought that they could replicate that example in the U.S. by partnering with the government. They were not as successful as the British, but they were definitely influenced by the British. So the British has set the tone collectively, and then these individuals like Arthington were following up on that.
And so you mentioned the ACS. At what point does Robert Arthington connect with the ACS? And talk to us about what was happening in the United States at the time with the desires of the ACS and the philanthropy of Mr. Robert Arthington. At what point do they sort of meet
Mm-hmm.
or connect?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the most important developments that preceded the founding of Arthington was the Civil War in the U.S. So, after a long delay and lots of back and forth arguments, political arguments as to the fate of the Union, there was the outbreak of Civil War. And initially, there was quite a bit of hopefulness on the part of those of African descent living in the U.S. But that was short lived. And soon there came a backlash. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan were formed. They were going around trying to intimidate, people of African descent. And it is in that context that many people in South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina as well, began to write the ACS requesting support for immigration to Liberia. And they were then able to connect with someone like Arthington, the British philanthropist, to put up the money, which would pay for transportation, pretty much, and the purchase of land.
So there is interest from the ACS. People want to go back to West Africa, the land from whence they had come. Let's look at the demographics now. You send me some data, and I look some other stuff online as well. Let's look at where in the states they came from first. I think you said what 30-40% came from North Carolina, and then South Carolina, probably another 30-40%, followed by Georgia, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that order.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so basically what I have is a spreadsheet with all of the families, individuals actually, who came to Arthington. And then if you do a organization of the spreadsheet by last names, you can see the families that clustered together, or you can do a breakdown by state of origin, and then you get the data that way. But yeah, so that information I have available here.
And I was able to look at the data in some detail. You had the largest family. Well, I don't know if they were all families, but people with the same last name that came from the United States were the Wrights.
Yes.
34 individuals on several different ships, followed by the Hills, and you had the Askews, the Bracewells, lots and lots of other different families.
That's right.
But let's talk about how the voyages were organized to bring people from the United States and ultimately to Arthington.
Yeah, I think that the two most important voyages or ships consist of the one that brought 79 repatriates to Liberia in December 1869, because people on that ship were the ones responsible for the establishment of the settlement. The government of Liberia had purchased land from people living in the area, and then the land was set aside for this community. And so when the people arrived, they were in Monrovia from December until March, a few months. And at that point, women and children remained in Monrovia, but the men went to the area that became Arthington. Now, the story of Arthington is really very important in this respect. It has come to be shrouded by, as we say in Liberia, a lot of lie, claims, right, that have come to overshadow the reality. And the reality is a lot more interesting and very, very powerful. That's why I think that as Argentinians are celebrating their return to the community, they need to look back at those who came before them and to see the role that people played, the hardships they faced that they overcame, and what they were able to achieve with beginning with very little. So one of the things, that we often hear in Liberian history is that those who came from the U.S. or elsewhere took over communities that were existing. They moved into the towns that were there. Certainly that was not the case with Arthington. According to an observer who was in Liberia when Arthington was being established, he says that this area consisted of unbroken wilderness. So it made clearings and the building of huts, because when they first settled, it was in huts. Again, one of the life stories, people came and were building these big frame houses right away. No, no, no. They came and they had to build huts, and that's where they started. And then after that, dividing with their family what was left of the food that the ACS had sent. So it was a rough beginning. And the wilderness part of it was critical because when they cut the trees, those trees then supplied the wood that they would use to make planks that they would then eventually use for furniture and houses, etc.
And to build the frame houses.
Yes, they're frame houses.
The frame houses for which most of the settlements are well known for.
Yes.
So you say that initially they lived in huts,
Yes,
and then felled the trees and then used the timber to build houses, basically.
exactly. And when I was in Liberia, I consulted an architect about those frame houses. I asked him, I said, so how come those frame houses, some of them lasted over 100 years?
Yeah.
And he said, the truth is, they would have continued up to now if people who inherited them understood how they came to be. Because he said, among those who came were carpenters, right? And other artisans. And they knew the qualities of wood and what you could do with different types of timber. But not only that, because some of the wood in Liberia was new to them, they consulted with people who have been living in the area for long about what is the quality of this wood, what you can use it for. There are trees in Liberia that termites don't touch. They don't bother, they would not eat it. And it was those trees that they used for building frame houses. They were impervious to termites. What? The weather and other conditions would affect them. So over the course of several generations, what would happen is that if a plank started to deteriorate, well, there were people in the community who knew about carpentry, and they would go and get a plank from the same kind of tree and replace that one. And they kept replacing and keeping the house going. But the generation that came around the time of the Second World War were more fascinated about moving to Monrovia or building houses with zinc or cement, and they abandoned those houses.
Yep. So let's go back and take another look at the demographics in terms of the age distribution of those who came from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, I believe Mississippi and other parts. I looked at the age distribution. I was fascinated. Under 9 years of age, you had 39% of the people. Between ages 10 to 20, you had 25%. Ages 21 to 30, about 15%. So if you take those first three categories, about almost 79 to 80% of the people were actually under 30 years old. So it was basically a young person's operation. Anyway.
Yeah. And, it would be useful. I haven't done this because you're posing this question now, and it's making me to reflect. But it'll be, I think, instructive to examine the demographics of the
Uh-huh.
societies they came from, because they, this spread might have reflected the same kind of distribution that existed in South Carolina, North Carolina, among people of African descent. But the reality is that whether or not it did, if you read the letters and records of people who went to Liberia, they
Uh-huh.
often would emphasize the fact that they went to secure a future for their children. If they
Uh,
didn't have access to schools in the US, they wanted to go to Liberia because they could create their own schools or churches and worship as they pleased. And so the whole issue of liberty, doing what you felt was best for you and your family, was a key
uh-huh.
motivator. And the children were a main focus.
Yeah. And so say with the demographics, let me continue by saying that between ages 31 to 40, 13%, between ages 41 to 50, 5%, and those more than or in excess of 50, another 2%, and more than 60, probably about 1%.
Yeah.
I know you talk about the age distribution looking out for the young ones, so to speak, the next generation. I'm not too sure if I agree with you about whether we should do a comparative analysis between that population that came to Liberia and those who stayed, because I would think that if you were looking out for your kids, then most of the people who are younger would tend to go, and most of the people who are older would tend to stay, right?
Well, that's one possibility, but it also could be
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
if the demographics in the U.S. was similar, then the people who
Mhm.
left were not an anomaly in terms of
Okay.
the ages, right? And the only main reason I threw that out is because around the time that they left, characteristic of the African American community was such that mostly young people were being brought in from Africa. The writing was on the wall that this long, centuries long process of importing Africans here to work was coming to an end. And so those who were invested in preserving that system told themselves, what we need to do is not bring in a middle age or older people here. What we're going to do is bring children. And if you look at the shipping records of ships that were intercepted coming from Africa with Africans on board, a lot of children were on there. Children and women, because they wanted women who could reproduce.
So let's look at the old folks side now, because we have a few of them here around us. So I found someone who's 77 years old, who was 77 at the time, Andrew Cathcart. Another I found, Violet Hogarth, was 72. But what surprised me was that Jacob Smith was listed as actually 99 years old.
Mhm.
And initially, I sort of questioned that because I was of two minds, really. I was thinking, it's not possible that a 99-year-old man would get on a ship. But then my wife said to me, maybe this was this guy's last hurrah. He wanted to go and see
Mhm.
where his people came from.
Mhm.
And that would be his final acting life.
Yeah. And that's very possible, quite frankly. You see, um, there was a renowned Liberian scholar, intellectual, Edward Blyden.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
Blyden taught at the University of Liberia, which was Liberia College at the time, uh,
Yes.
uh, published extensively in newspapers. His writings were collected into books subsequently. Blyden visited Arthington,
Yes, he did.
and he left several records of his impressions, his descriptions. And he said that members of the second group of repatriates to Liberia, who came from South Carolina, uh, they knew the African ethnic groups to which they were connected. Hill knew that his mother was Gola. What are the probabilities that he would end up in the very area from which his
All our
mother
people.
was taken? So
Huh.
the reality is that in places like South Carolina, Africans had just recently been brought to work on these plantations. There were native Africans in these communities. It's possible that someone who was older, given a chance, would have said, I want to go back to my native land. But we don't know. It requires more investigation. If there are descendants of the Smith or any of these other families that are interested, I would encourage them to dig into their archives, and try to figure out the backstory, the genealogy of their families.
If you look at the raw data again, you see several different last names, right? But there was one that struck me. Thomas Simpson, age 16 years old. And under the column for education, it says simply rights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in some instances, you have reads,
Mm-hmm.
and you have rights, you
Mm-hmm.
have reads and rights.
Mm-hmm.
And then the profession, you have farmers, carpenters, and all that. But life was very, very tough, I imagine, back then. But within a generation or two, they were able to transform a barren land basically into a sort of a significant agricultural outpost, right?
And to then transform community of people, many of whom didn't read or write when they arrived, into a community where education was prized and was supported with their own resources. It's interesting, for example, that one of the pastors in Arthington said when he was in the U.S., he wasn't a Christian. His parents went to church, but he didn't know anything, about Christianity per se, and he hadn't converted. So what he learned about Christianity, he learned in Liberia, and he learned enough to become a pastor. And so what was happening in communities like Arthington is that people were transforming themselves and their children. They were educating themselves and their children, creating institutions, right, that fostered learning.
In addition to the educational aspect, I want to look at the economy and to give people an idea of how strong it was. I've heard stories from the old people that there was a time the Hill and Wool Company was so wealthy, they did so well, that they actually made a loan to the government in Monrovia.
Yeah.
I don't know how accurate it is. I don't know if you heard that.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, they were. They were very successful. Now, I think it's important to start at the beginning, pretty much, of the story. And in part because it's important to dispel certain myths. The assumption made by many, and I've seen this included in some scholarly works, where one would expect the writers will go and investigate and collect evidence, but people would throw out claims that are not supported. And they say these people were successful with growing coffee because they were using native laborers. But again, that's why it's so important to go back to the records. What you find,
what does the record show?
Yeah, what you find is that these farms were family operations. If you take a Hogarth, for example, who was one of the Alonzo Hogarth, who was one of the leaders of the first group of repatriates. Well, he had 4 sons, and they were young, but together with his sons, they planted 5,000 coffee trees. 5,000 coffee trees sounds like a lot, but not really. If you take an acre, there's so many trees that 1 acre can hold. In a couple of acres, and you could have 5,000 trees. But he planted coffee. They planted, he and his sons, potatoes and cassava, rice, edibles and stuff, and vegetables. So here's a man who was used to planting things from the States. He comes and he now has access to his own land for his family, and he and his boys are planting. And the observer who wrote about him said he had access to no laborers outside of his family. If we go to other example, like Hill, or Bracewell, Solomon Hill, June Moore, or Bracewell, we find the same pattern. People relying on the family as a collective to undertake the farming and the work. Now, Bracewell planted 1,100 coffee trees along with food. Someone came and observed that. His wife and his daughters were actually weaving the fabric for the clothes that he and his sons were wearing. People might take this to be somewhat remarkable, but if we think about communities in the area, among the Gola, among the Loma, women were weaving, right?
Yeah.
And the women who were in Arlington were not far removed from that level of subsistence, do for self. We satisfy our own needs. And so his wife and his daughters were weaving. Now, an exceptional case, I want to be clear about this. This was reported by Blyden again. And this was about Reverend June Moore. So Moore and Hill, right, established,
Hill
and
and Moore,
Moore,
yeah.
This company,
Yes.
very successful company. Well, according to Blyden, there were two Hill young men who had helped Moore to plant his farm. But here's one of those aspects of the story that never get told. He turned around, bought land from the government, and gave to them as a thank you for having worked with him, apprenticed with him. And they, in turn, were able to plant their own farm with coffee. You follow?
So, yes, certainly the most significant crop coming out of the area was coffee. Coffee song from Arthington was "When My Coffee Gets Ripe, oh baby, oh, I will buy you a shoe." But let's get beyond the song now. I also heard from the old folks that there was a World Trade Fair. I forgot the exact year,
Yeah.
but I believe that the coffee from Liberia, from the Arthington area specifically, went over there and won first prize among coffees around the entire world. Did you hear that story? Can you verify it?
Well, I have not heard the one first prize piece, but I am aware of Liberia's participation in the World Fair in Philadelphia.
I was talking about the one in Chicago is the one I was talking
Okay.
about, I think.
And Liberia participated in the one in Chicago as well. But in the 1870s, Liberia participated in Philadelphia. That drew attention to Liberia's coffee and the importance of coffee, right? Why that crop emerged as dominant in the region. It has global implications. Many times I hear Liberians reciting or regurgitating certain dogmas that are enshrined in the Western scholarship. People quoting Ricardo, the economist, will talk about the importance of, for example, a comparative advantage. You say, oh, if a country, has this resource or these trees or this crop, then you need to focus on it. And the other countries will focus on what they naturally have, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you see, while that might have been a truism far back centuries ago, it has not held for a very long time. So with the creation of the British Empire, what Britain did was to remake the world in its image for its benefit. Coffee grew in Africa. It originated in Ethiopia as far as we know. And it became popular in the Middle East. Arabs drink a very thick coffee, but they love coffee. Turkish have a preference for a certain type of coffee, and from Turkey it's spread to France. Okay. So the British decide, because people are drinking coffee around the world, we are not going to rely on just getting coffee from where it originated. So they created plantations in Java, right? In Asia, in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, in a tropical area where they could grow coffee, they grew coffee. They did the same with tea. The tea was growing in India and Sri Lanka. They said, we want to grow tea in East Africa. So they brought East Asians to East Africa to grow the tea. That means then that they're controlling the supply no matter where it's coming from. Well, here is how Liberia enters the story. The preferred species of coffee that the British had planted in their various colonies was Robusta. The Arabica and Robusta were competing. Arabica being mainly grown in the Middle East area. And Robusta is the one, they call it Robusta, it's thought to be robust. It can last. Not that flavorful, but it's hardy. A disease developed that was attacking that species of coffee. And because the plantations in the British colony all had the same species, they were all susceptible to the same disease. So suddenly, they were being wiped out. Now, Liberia has a species of coffee that was unique to Liberia called Liberica. And it's a coffee that Hill, Moore, and the Arthingtonians were growing. So you have this disaster, the collapse of the world coffee supply, and Liberians step up to fill that void with Liberica coffee. And this had a profound impact. And that's why I was saying Arthington has had an impact on the world. That's a case where they certainly did. And they stepped up and filled that void. Mostly, Liberia was exporting coffee to Hamburg because Germany or Hamburg at the time was a separate, one of the separate states. But through Hamburg, coffee would then go to the coffee markets of Europe. The UK wasn't drinking that much coffee, mostly tea, but we sold coffee to them as well. The US was not a major market, although we assumed that everything was going to the US.
So let's not leave the impression, well, you are accurate in everything you said, but I don't want to leave the impression that coffee was the only product or cash crop coming out of Arthington.
Oh, no.
We also had sugarcane and ginger.
Yep.
Just talk about that briefly.
Yeah, ginger too was important, on the world market. And one of the things that I am struck by, I'd like to share with people is for Europeans, access to tropical fruits. Initially, it was like a novelty, and it was also a sign of prosperity. If you could serve someone pineapple, it was like, oh, this man has arrived. The same thing was happening in reverse in Africa. If we had access on the ground to palm wine, right? But when brandy arrived, and one of the local rulers could serve people brandy, they're like, Chief, you've arrived, you're successful. So the imports were important to establish, right, that you're a significant person. Well, one of the things, because tropical fruits could not be kept for prolonged periods, was that Europeans would then try to preserve them in a variety of ways. Marmalade, orange marmalade, was one way in which orange didn't grow in Europe, could be preserved so that you could at least have a sample of the flavor. And ginger, in ginger snaps and other snacks, gingerbread, etc., you see how the fruits of the tropic and crops from the tropic came to influence the cuisine in the West. So one of the brands of ginger that I tend to go for in the supermarkets here is from Sweden. And I like it because it's intense. Some of the other ones, they're just sugary and a little bit of ginger in it. Well, here you have a Scandinavian country. Yeah, you cannot grow ginger, and they are renowned for the production of ginger. And in Switzerland, the
Mm.
production of chocolate. Same thing. Tropical crops popular in Europe.
So let's come back to the smallpox outbreak. I believe it was 1929, and Arthington again is pivotal in that epidemic. Tell us what happened, and I believe the case was subsequently resolved by Louis Arthur Grimes of the Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law fame.
Oh yeah, yeah. He was the AG of Liberia. The Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Yeah. And so I would like to start by commenting on smallpox. It's not been around for long enough that many people don't recognize the symptoms of it or the impact of it. But unlike chickenpox, smallpox would have a devastating, impact. It will create like holes in the skin of
Yeah.
someone who was attacked by it. And I'm saying this, I'm sharing this because I'm inviting viewers to reflect. Did they know anyone when they were growing up who might have had smallpox, right? Yeah. So I just thought I would cite some of the symptoms so that the viewers can reflect on whether they knew anyone growing up who might have had smallpox. But smallpox, there was an outbreak in Liberia, 1929, and the government commandeered some houses to serve as places where people could be quarantined. We had these big facilities and stuff. And the house of Mr. Charles Wright was one of those houses. So people were kept there during I want to say pandemic, but the epidemic. And he sued the government for compensation. It took about 9 years, but eventually Louis Arthur Grimes served as an arbitrator, and he recommended that yes, Mr. Wright should be compensated, and he was paid for the time that the government occupied his house.
Mhm. So, are there any final thoughts you might want to put? Maybe just re-emphasize the context and importance of the Arthington story for Liberia as well as global affairs.
Yes, I'd say for one thing, you mentioned sugar and the growing of sugarcane. And so the sugar was really important for the domestic market because the farmers upriver was satisfying the domestic demand for sugar. It wasn't so much to export. They wouldn't compete with the international markets, but they were definitely, filling a void. So that meant that you could save on foreign exchange by meeting your own needs. But the consequence of that, one of the negative consequences, was alcoholism. And so as people had access to cane juice, right, there was an increase in the use of alcohol. And that provoked the formation of what were called temperance societies. And these were groups committed to discouraging people from drinking, right? And one such group was formed in Arthington, actually. Okay. So, yeah, those are, some aspects of the story.